Something strange is happening to Rick Ross, and nobody in hip-hop can stop staring at the wreckage. The boss who used to move mountains with a single verse just watched his brand new album faceplant on live television, and the man who called it before anybody else, Curtis Jackson himself, is refusing to let a single hour pass without twisting the knife again. Rick Ross spent almost 2 years telling everybody Set in Stone was going to be his generational moment, his statue, his monument. Instead, the timeline handed him a headstone. 17,200 units. 19 tracks. 14 features. And a caption from 50 Cent that has already been screenshotted more times than the album has been streamed. Rick Ross wanted a coronation. What Rick Ross got was a comedy special hosted by everybody who ever warned him this day was coming. You need to understand how ugly this actually is before we go any further, because the numbers alone do not capture the humiliation. Rick Ross did not stumble out of nowhere. Rick Ross announced this project like it was a state visit. Rick Ross booked a world tour. Rick Ross lined up a car show, a press run, a podcast circuit, and a promotional machine that would normally guarantee a top 10 debut. And still, when the first week numbers dropped, the entire hip-hop internet did the same double take at the same moment. Set in Stone landed at number 39 on the Billboard 200 with roughly 19,000 equivalent units, and the earlier projections that leaked online had it even lower. Some whispered as low as 2,000 copies in the first day, a rumor so brutal that even people who love Rick Ross flinched when they read it. That number was never officially verified. It did not need to be. In the timeline, a rumor with the right rhythm is louder than a fact with the wrong one, and this rumor had rhythm for days. Right on cue, 50 Cent arrived. Curtis Jackson has been waiting 18 years for a week like this, and Curtis Jackson did not waste a single second of it. The first post hit Instagram before the ink on the Billboard chart was dry. He got away with it for a while, but it's over now. Jig is up. 20 features under 10,000 sales. Damn, boy. It's over. That single caption traveled faster than any track on Set in Stone. Fans laughed. Blogs pounced. Podcasters recorded emergency episodes. And then, before anybody had processed the first hit, 50 Cent delivered a second one, this time reacting to the 2,000 copy rumor with a screenshot and a punchline sharp enough to draw blood. I just saw your record sales. LOL. 2,000. What the? That was it. No paragraph. No essay. Just 7 words and a laugh, and the internet finished the rest of the sentence for him. That is the 50 Cent formula in its purest form: say almost nothing, imply everything, and let the audience turn the imply into a headline. But here is where the story gets bigger than a single Instagram post, and this is the part nobody in hip-hop wants to say out loud. Rick Ross did not just lose a first-week sales race. Rick Ross lost a war he did not know he was in. That war was not with 50 Cent. That war was with the algorithm. And the algorithm, as several commentators have started to whisper this week, has a very particular opinion about anybody who spends the year picking fights with Drake. Whether that framing holds water or not, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Every artist who stood on the opposite side of the Drake conflict in the last 18 months has watched their numbers wobble. Every artist who leaned into public shots at Drake has watched playlist placements evaporate. Every artist who tried to cash in on the wave of anti-Drake sentiment has, in one way or another, ended up sitting exactly where Rick Ross is sitting right now. Looking at empty seats in Miami. Looking at discount codes on tour tickets. Looking at a caption from 50 Cent that will not stop trending. Now, the timeline never sleeps, and within hours of the numbers going public, the sales chart became a punching bag. Screenshots of Rick Ross's Miami tour venue started circulating, and the picture was unforgivable. Row after row of green dots. Entire sections of the arena still available. And then, the piece that turned mockery into meme fuel, a buy one get 50% off deal that Rick Ross's team quietly rolled out to try and keep the show from looking like a ghost town. Nobody was ready for that. Not the fans, not the critics, not even the podcast circuit that has been eating this beef for a year. Rick Ross has been a lot of things in this business. A boss. A brand. A businessman. A brawler. What Rick Ross has never been, in 20 years of running the game, is a discount code rapper. And yet, here we are, watching Rick Ross's team slice tour tickets in half like they are running a Black Friday sale. The mockery did not stay online. The mockery infected every podcast, every commentary channel, every hip-hop personality with a microphone. Joe Budden's crew spent an entire episode dissecting the rollout. DJ Academics broke down the stream count and asked, on camera, whether the streaming algorithm was actively working against Rick Ross. Tony Yayo, still riding shotgun for 50 Cent after 2 decades, described the sales as a self-inflicted wound. Uncle Murda folded the flop into his year-end wrap-up before the year was even over. And every single one of them landed on the same conclusion in different clothes. Rick Ross poked a bear the size of Drake, and now Rick Ross is paying a tax he can never negotiate down. That is the loyalty tax era in one sentence. If you cross a fanbase that big, the fanbase does not argue with you. The fanbase simply stops streaming you. Bye-bye to somewhere between half and 80% of your mutual audience. That is the #1 commentator throughout this week, and while it has zero scientific backing, it is all the emotional truth Rick Ross fans have been trying to deny for months. Rick Ross, of course, is not built to sit quietly. Rick Ross does not do quiet. Rick Ross sat in front of a camera, leaned into the shot, and delivered the kind of speech that would sound majestic if the numbers behind it were different. Rick Ross compared himself to Bosch, the Renaissance painter. Rick Ross said the value of art is not measured by the first week. Rick Ross said Set in Stone was made to live for generations. Rick Ross reminded everybody that when other rappers were doing 1 million first week, Rick Ross was doing 150,000, and yet Rick Ross is still here 20 years later while most of those million-selling stars are not. That is a real point. That is a legitimate argument. And that is exactly why the internet ate it alive. Because when the timeline is already laughing, dignity reads as denial, and philosophy reads as cope. Rick Ross was not wrong. Rick Ross was just too late. Now, some of Rick Ross's defenders, and there are still plenty of them, have pushed back on the flop narrative with a fair argument. Rick Ross has never been a first-week monster. Rick Ross has always played what industry veterans call the long game. Rick Ross earns his money from touring, from licensing, from Wingstop, from his car show, from real estate, from every business venture he has built brick by brick over 2 decades. A weak first week does not empty Rick Ross's bank account. A weak first week does not repossess the mansion. A weak first week is, in the pure business sense, a rounding error for a man who has diversified as aggressively as Rick Ross has. That argument is real. That argument is defensible. And that argument, unfortunately for Rick Ross, is not the argument the culture is currently interested in having. The culture wants a body. The culture wants a punchline. The culture wants the fall from grace it was promised the moment Rick Ross squared up against Drake and 50 Cent at the same time. When the smoke clears, the sales chart is only the surface of what happened this week. The real story is what happened underneath the sales chart. Because Set in Stone is not just an album. Set in Stone is a stress test for the entire modern hip-hop ecosystem, and the ecosystem failed Rick Ross in ways that should terrify every veteran artist watching from the sidelines. Streaming algorithms are no longer neutral referees. Streaming algorithms are shaped by fan behavior, and fan behavior in 2026 is more tribal than it has been in decades. If you are on Team Drake, you skip anything with a Rick Ross feature. If you are on Team Ross, you avoid anything that smells like a Drake cosign. If you are neither, you are pulled into the tribe by the timeline whether you asked to join or not. That is not a rumor. That is not a conspiracy. That is the emotional architecture of the entire streaming economy right now, and Rick Ross walked into that architecture with a 19-track album that could not decide whether it was a comeback, a diss project, or a business flex. 19 tracks. 14 features. Read those numbers one more time. 14 out of 19. Rick Ross's own album is roughly 75% guest verses, and that is being generous, because some of the tracks that are technically Rick Ross solo cuts have hooks and bridges handled by other voices. What you are looking at is not an album in the classical sense. What you are looking at is a compilation project with Rick Ross's face on the cover, and 50 Cent immediately smelled that from across the room. That is the entire subtext of the 20 features under 10,000 sales caption. Curtis Jackson was not just mocking the numbers. Curtis Jackson was mocking the concept. Curtis Jackson was pointing at the crumbling stagecraft of a veteran who had to invite 14 guests to his own party and still could not sell tickets to it. Nobody in this business studies public humiliation the way Curtis Jackson does. Curtis Jackson has been mocking Rick Ross for 18 years, since the Officer Ricky documents leaked, since the baby mama drama, since the Miami shootout, since every stumble Rick Ross has ever had. Curtis Jackson has built an entire second career on Rick Ross's setbacks. So when Set in Stone finally slipped, Curtis Jackson did what Curtis Jackson always does. He did not attack the man. He attacked the moment. Curtis Jackson posted the sales screenshot. Curtis Jackson posted the caption. Curtis Jackson tagged nobody, quoted nobody, argued with nobody. Curtis Jackson simply held up the mirror and let Rick Ross see the reflection in front of the entire timeline. The Rick Ross response, when it finally came, was the exact response Curtis Jackson wanted. Rick Ross went on Instagram. Rick Ross went on podcasts. Rick Ross went on stage. Rick Ross defended himself over and over and over. Rick Ross said the streaming numbers were still climbing. Rick Ross said the physicals would arrive. Rick Ross said the top of next week would tell a different story. Rick Ross said the 20th anniversary tour was still on. Rick Ross said the money from touring, licensing, and business ventures would dwarf whatever the album did. Rick Ross said everything a boss is supposed to say. And every time Rick Ross said it, the caption from Curtis Jackson trended just a little bit higher. Because in modern hip-hop, if you have to explain the flop is already winning. Right on cue, the timeline lit up with punchlines, screenshots, and side-eyes, and the comparison started flying. Larry June, whose latest project was released in the same window, reportedly outperformed Set in Stone in first-week units, and that fact alone became a meme within hours. Rick Ross being outsold by an independent artist known for smooth, low-key deliveries is not just a chart story. Rick Ross being outsold by Larry June is a symbolic story. It signals that the modern listener is quietly moving away from the maximalist, features-heavy, luxury rap format that Rick Ross helped define, and toward artists who arrive with less noise and more intention. That is a cultural pivot, not a first-week fluke. And Rick Ross, sitting at number 39 on the Billboard 200, is watching that pivot happen in real time, from the wrong side of it. Now, whether that framing holds water or not, one thing is impossible to ignore. Rick Ross did not just lose a sales race this week. Rick Ross lost the narrative war that he has been trying to control for 2 years. The moment Rick Ross decided to step into the Drake conflict on the opposite side, Rick Ross wagered the loyalty of every listener who had ever shared a Ross-Drake collaboration. That was millions of listeners. That was billions of streams. That was, in cold business terms, an audience the size of a mid-tier country, and Rick Ross bet all of it on the assumption that Drake was about to fall. Drake did not fall. Drake regrouped. Drake released Iceman. Drake kept the fanbase intact. And now Rick Ross is standing on the losing side of a war he did not need to fight, holding a 19-track album that most of his former listeners refused to open. When Rick Ross went on the Joe Budden podcast this past week, the internet did not clip the music discussion. The internet clipped the Drake segment. Every viral snippet from that appearance was Rick Ross being asked about Drake, dodging Drake, sidestepping Drake, and refusing to fully commit to either continuing the beef or ending it. That in itself is a tell. If Rick Ross were confident in the album, Rick Ross would have used the platform to talk about the album. Instead, Rick Ross used the platform to explain his position on Drake, which the algorithm read as another signal that Set in Stone is really a chapter in the Drake conflict rather than a standalone artistic statement. The algorithm rewards artistic statements. The algorithm punishes conflict extensions. Rick Ross, once again, walked into the wrong lane at the wrong moment. The most fascinating part of this entire cycle is that Rick Ross keeps handing 50 Cent new material, and 50 Cent keeps repackaging it into content faster than any comedy show could. When Rick Ross's tour venues showed empty seats, 50 Cent posted them. When Rick Ross's discount codes leaked, 50 Cent posted them. When Rick Ross's first day rumor of 2,000 copies started spreading, 50 Cent posted the screenshot with a laugh. When Rick Ross tried to compare himself to Bosch, 50 Cent did not even need to say anything, the timeline did it for him, and 50 Cent simply reposted the mockery with a single crying laughing emoji. That is the difference between a rapper who is fighting for his image and a rapper who has already won it. Rick Ross is defending. 50 Cent is harvesting. And every day that this cycle continues, 50 Cent's brand grows and Rick Ross's brand shrinks by the exact same margin. Still, none of this means Rick Ross is finished. That is the honest part of this story that nobody wants to admit while the memes are still flying. Rick Ross is not finished. Rick Ross is bruised. Those are two different words with two very different consequences. A finished artist cannot tour. Rick Ross can tour, and even a discounted arena will sell out to the diehards. A finished artist has no revenue. Rick Ross has Wingstop, publishing catalog, real estate holdings, sponsorship contracts, and a car show that pulls in 6 figures a weekend. A finished artist cannot pivot. Rick Ross can pivot, and in 6 months he can release a project half this size with a single strategic feature and reset the entire narrative. The Rick Ross empire is not collapsing. The Rick Ross empire is being publicly humbled, and there is a big difference between humbling and burial. But if Rick Ross does not read the humbling correctly, if Rick Ross keeps chasing old feuds instead of new fans, the humbling can absolutely become the burial. Rick Ross has watched other veterans miss that transition. Rick Ross is not immune from it. And now we arrive at the Drake shadow, because no conversation about Set in Stone can avoid the man whose name is never on the track list but is somehow on every conversation about the track list. Drake did not diss Rick Ross this week. Drake did not comment on Rick Ross this week. Drake did not post about Rick Ross this week. Drake did not need to. The absence of Drake from Rick Ross's album is the loudest note on Rick Ross's album. Every previous Rick Ross project that mattered, Teflon Don, Mastermind, Rather You Than Me, had at least one Drake feature carrying at least one anthem tier record. Aston Martin Music. Stay Schemin'. Diced Pineapples. Gold Roses. Every one of those songs went further than any Rick Ross solo record ever did. Every one of those songs is a Drake cosign wrapped in Rick Ross's brand. And every one of those songs is missing from Set in Stone, because Rick Ross burned the Drake cosign lifeline the moment he decided a public feud was worth more than a public partnership. That decision, more than any streaming algorithm, more than any 50-cent post, more than any tour ticket discount, is what actually crushed Set in Stone. Rick Ross did not lose because his pen fell off. Rick Ross's pen is still one of the sharpest in the genre. Rick Ross lost because Rick Ross underestimated exactly how much of his career had been carried on Drake's back. When the cosign disappeared, the algorithm disappeared with it, because the algorithm was never a mystical force to begin with. The algorithm was simply the sum of every Drake fan who used to hit play on Ross records because Drake was on them. Take Drake out, take those fans out. Take those fans out, take the streams out. Take the streams out, take the sales out. Take the sales out, take the venues out. Take the venues out, and suddenly Rick Ross is offering buy one get 50% off deals in Miami, and Curtis Jackson is laughing at a screenshot on Instagram. The domino chain is that simple, and Rick Ross set it in motion himself, one interview at a time. Every time Rick Ross said Drake did not write his own lyrics, Rick Ross knocked down a domino. Every time Rick Ross called Iceman horrendous, Rick Ross knocked down a domino. Every time Rick Ross gave the Ross Drake fans a reason to pick a side, Rick Ross knocked down a domino. By the time Set in Stone dropped, the last domino had already fallen, and the album was releasing into a room that Rick Ross had personally emptied. That is the story nobody is saying with this much clarity, but that is the story. Rick Ross did not get ambushed. Rick Ross ambushed himself, slowly, publicly, and on camera, over the course of 2 years. Meanwhile, Curtis Jackson watched the entire operation like a hawk. Curtis Jackson said years ago that Rick Ross would eventually collapse under the weight of his own borrowed shine. Curtis Jackson said the features would dry up. Curtis Jackson said the tour would shrink. Curtis Jackson said the streams would fall off a cliff. Every one of those predictions has now come true within the same 7-day window, and Curtis Jackson is not being humble about it. Curtis Jackson posted the sales screenshot next to a montage of his own multi-platinum plaques. Curtis Jackson posted the empty venue photos next to his own G-Unit reunion tour receipts. Curtis Jackson threw his own takes into the fire and then poured gasoline on top. The entire timeline turned into a Curtis Jackson highlight reel this week, and Rick Ross was cast as the losing team in the highlight package. Round after round in a war that refuses to end, this is now the 18th year of 50 Cent versus Rick Ross, and after 18 years, the scoreboard is not close. 50 Cent has outlasted, out-trolled, and out-earned Rick Ross in almost every measurable category. 50 Cent has television shows on multiple networks. 50 Cent has a liquor empire. 50 Cent has film studios. 50 Cent has a G-Unit reunion tour that sold out arenas without a discount code in sight. 50 Cent has, most importantly, the psychological win. That is the thing you cannot buy back. Once a rival owns the mockery lane compounds forever, and the audience will lean into the mockery every time the rival releases a project. Rick Ross has been fighting that gravity for almost 2 decades, and this week the gravity finally won. Now, of course, hip-hop is bigger than any single feud, and the culture will absolutely give Rick Ross more chapters. Rick Ross is not the first legend to face a public humbling, and Rick Ross will not be the last. Jay-Z faced it after Kingdom Come. Nas faced it after Nostradamus. Lil Wayne faced it after multiple album delays. Every one of those veterans found their way back, and every one of those veterans did it by shrinking the scope of the next project rather than expanding it. That is the lesson Rick Ross needs to steal from history, and steal fast. Do not release another 19-track compilation. Do not chase Drake. Do not chase 50 Cent. Do not chase the algorithm. Release 9 tracks. Release 6 tracks. Release one perfect record with one perfect feature and let the culture rediscover why Rick Ross ever mattered in the first place. That is the recovery blueprint. Everything else is noise, and Rick Ross has had a very noisy week. But then again, Rick Ross has never been famous for shrinking. Rick Ross is famous for expansion. Rick Ross is famous for maximalism. Rick Ross is famous for the mansion, the yacht, the fleet of cars, the horse, the ostrich, the 20,000 square foot estate. Rick Ross's entire brand is built on the aesthetic of more, and asking Rick Ross to release less might be asking Rick Ross to become a different artist entirely. That is the trap Rick Ross is in. The brand that built Rick Ross is the same brand that is now holding Rick Ross under. The maximalist rapper cannot pivot to minimalism without losing the aesthetic that made him a legend, and the aesthetic that made him a legend is exactly what is misfiring in the streaming era. That is the Rick Ross paradox, and it is not going to solve itself in a single news cycle. That is also why the mockery from Curtis Jackson lands so hard, because Curtis Jackson is not just mocking a bad first week. Curtis Jackson is mocking an entire business philosophy. Curtis Jackson is essentially saying, in every post, that the era of the luxury rap frontman is over, and the era of the ruthless businessman is here, and Rick Ross missed the pivot by a decade. Curtis Jackson pivoted to television. Curtis Jackson pivoted to production. Curtis Jackson pivoted to distribution. Rick Ross pivoted to Wingstop, which is real money but is not the same lane, and every time Curtis Jackson posts about a new Starz show or a new liquor deal or a new film financing arrangement, the gap between the two men widens by another business quarter. This week, that gap became visible in a way that Rick Ross's team can no longer paper over. The saddest part of the entire cycle might be that Rick Ross saw it coming. Rick Ross has been unusually defensive in interviews this year. Rick Ross has referenced the Drake feud unprompted. Rick Ross has referenced 50 Cent unprompted. Rick Ross has preemptively dismissed critics who had not even criticized him yet. That is the body language of a veteran who knows the numbers might not land, and is trying to soften the impact in advance. It did not work. It never works. The audience can smell the preemptive defense from 100 miles away, and the algorithm can smell it from further than that. If you have to spend an entire press run insulating your project from criticism, the project is already telegraphing its own reception. Rick Ross telegraphed this reception for months. The timeline simply arrived on schedule. And yet, and this is the part the mockery machine keeps skipping over, there is still gold buried inside set in stone. There are moments on the album where Rick Ross's pen absolutely delivers. There are lines that would trend on their own if the numbers had not swallowed the discourse. There are hooks that could still catch fire on TikTok in the next 6 weeks if the culture ever moves past the sales chart. Rick Ross did not deliver a bad album. Rick Ross delivered a good album into a room that had already decided to laugh at him. Those are two different failures with two different solutions. A bad album cannot be saved. A good album received poorly can absolutely be saved, but only if Rick Ross stops feeding the mockery machine long enough for the music to breathe. The problem is that Rick Ross does not know how to stop, because stopping means silence, and silence, in the current attention economy, feels like death to a brand built on volume. The other unspoken layer here is what this moment does to Rick Ross's Miami legacy. Rick Ross has been, for the better part of 2 decades, the most visible ambassador of Miami rap. Rick Ross carried the city on his shoulders after the deaths and disappearances of the previous generation. Rick Ross gave Miami a national brand that had not existed since the Uncle Luke era. Rick Ross made luxury rap synonymous with the Miami skyline. This week, the Miami tour venue is half empty, and every empty seat is a small crack in that legacy. The city has not turned on Rick Ross. The city loves Rick Ross. But the city is also watching what happens when the biggest boss in the room can no longer fill his own arena on his own turf, and the city, like every other city, will draw quiet conclusions about the future of the crown. At the same time, 50 Cent has been doing something almost surgical in the background of all of this. Every mockery post has been calibrated. Every laugh has been strategic. Every screenshot has been chosen not for maximum cruelty but for maximum shareability. 50 Cent is not just mocking Rick Ross. 50 Cent is building content. Every post drives followers. Every follower drives streams for 50 Cent's own catalog, which just happens to be doing very well in the same week Rick Ross is faceplanting. Curtis Jackson has turned Rick Ross's flop into a marketing campaign for the Curtis Jackson brand, and Rick Ross is unwittingly funding the campaign by refusing to log off. Every Rick Ross response gives 50 Cent another cycle of content. Every Rick Ross rebuttal gives 50 Cent another headline. The math is brutal. The math is one-sided. And the math is not going to change until Rick Ross changes his behavior, which he has shown zero interest in doing. Now, the timeline never sleeps, and there is a real chance this narrative flips inside the next 30 days. That is the beauty and the danger of the modern hip-hop cycle. A single viral moment can rewrite a story that looked buried the day before. If Rick Ross releases a surprise single with the right feature, not Drake, obviously, but a strategic left-field collaboration that catches the culture by surprise, Rick Ross can reset the entire conversation before the first week even fully closes on the Billboard side. If Rick Ross drops a documentary, a business announcement, or a genuinely shocking revelation on his own timeline, Rick Ross can absolutely take back the frame. The Rick Ross brand is too big, too established, and too well-funded to stay pinned under this narrative forever. The question is not whether Rick Ross can escape. The question is whether Rick Ross has the discipline to escape without lighting another fire on his way out. For 50 Cent, the calculation is different. 50 Cent does not need Rick Ross to recover. 50 Cent does not need Rick Ross to respond. 50 Cent does not need Rick Ross to do anything at all. 50 Cent has already banked the win. Every future Rick Ross release will now be measured against this first week number, and any project that opens under 17,200 units will simply be filed under still flopping. That is the trap 50 Cent has quietly closed around Rick Ross's future. Set in Stone is no longer just an album. Set in Stone is now the yardstick, the ceiling, the humiliation benchmark. Rick Ross will have to release a project big enough to erase this number before the culture forgets it, and the culture, being what it is, will not forget it easily. Meanwhile, the Drake camp is doing what the Drake camp always does in moments like these. Absolutely nothing publicly, and probably everything privately. Drake does not need to post. Drake does not need to speak. Drake does not need to gloat. Drake's numbers are speaking loudly enough on their own, and Drake's silence is a form of confidence that his opposition simply cannot manufacture. That silence is also strategic. If Drake commented on Rick Ross's flop, Drake would give Rick Ross a lifeline. Rick Ross could pivot the entire narrative into a fresh Drake beef and steal the news cycle back. By staying silent, Drake denies Rick Ross the oxygen. That is the same discipline Drake showed during the Kendrick moment, and it is a discipline Rick Ross has never learned. Rick Ross will comment on anything. Rick Ross will react to anything. Rick Ross will feed anything. That is why 50 Cent keeps beating him, and that is why Drake keeps outlasting him. The final question, the one the timeline is quietly circling this week, is what happens to Rick Ross the person once the news cycle finally moves on. Rick Ross has never publicly cracked. Rick Ross has never publicly wavered. Rick Ross has always projected the same immovable boss energy from the yacht, from the mansion, from the studio. But even bosses have private moments, and those moments do not stay private forever in the current media environment. If a single leaked video shows Rick Ross rattled, the mockery cycle triples in a day. If a single associate leaks a phone call, the mockery cycle triples in a day. Rick Ross's brand is now in a defensive posture whether Rick Ross admits it or not, and defensive postures always eventually crack, because the pressure only comes from one direction. Curtis Jackson knows this. Curtis Jackson counts on this. Curtis Jackson has been circling this exact moment for 18 years, and Curtis Jackson is not about to release the pressure now. When the smoke clears from this entire week, three things will be undeniable. Rick Ross had a first-week flop that will follow him for the rest of the album cycle. 50 Cent extracted maximum content, maximum mockery, and maximum brand growth from the flop with surgical precision. And Drake, without lifting a finger, remained the invisible king whose absence from the Rick Ross tracklist told the entire story before anybody read the first review. Those are the three truths. Everything else is opinion, spin, or timeline noise. But those three truths, taken together, describe the exact shape of the modern hip-hop hierarchy right now, and Rick Ross is sitting on the wrong side of all three. So the real question for you, sitting on the other side of the screen, is not whether Set in Stone was good or bad. The real question is whether Rick Ross can survive the next 30 days without adding another log to the fire. Do you think Rick Ross should log off, cancel the press run, and let the album breathe? Do you think Rick Ross should double down, drop a diss track, and turn Set in Stone into a full-scale war project? Or do you think this cycle is already too far gone, and Rick Ross should quietly pivot back to the business ventures that have always paid the real bills? Drop your take in the comments, because the answer to this question is going to define the next 12 months of Rick Ross's career, and the timeline is genuinely split on which direction he should move. Some fans want the boss to fight. Some fans want the boss to retreat. And some fans are already lighting candles for the empire. One thing is impossible to ignore, though. Curtis Jackson is not done. Curtis Jackson has more posts in the chamber. Curtis Jackson has more screenshots in the reserve. Curtis Jackson has an entire 18-year archive of ammunition, and Curtis Jackson has never, in all those years, missed a chance to reload when Rick Ross gave him the opening. Rick Ross gave Curtis Jackson a very big opening this week, and the next round of mockery is already loading in the background. Whether Rick Ross wants to acknowledge it or not, this feud is now entering its most dangerous chapter. Not because Curtis Jackson is angry. Curtis Jackson is not angry. Curtis Jackson is entertained. And an entertained 50 Cent is the version of Curtis Jackson that has always done the most damage. This is the smiling assassin era of the beef. Rick Ross should be very, very careful about how he steps into the next 30 days, because every step is being watched, screenshotted, and prepared as future content. And yet, if there is one lesson this business has taught us over and over, it is that hip-hop reinvents itself faster than any other genre on earth. Careers that looked buried have come back. Artists that looked finished have returned. Numbers that looked catastrophic have been erased by a single hit record dropped at the right moment. Rick Ross has one shot to write that chapter. The question is whether Rick Ross uses that shot on another Drake diss, or whether Rick Ross uses that shot on a genuine artistic reset. The culture is watching. Curtis Jackson is watching. Drake is watching. Every rival, every fan, every commentator, and every algorithm is now watching the next Rick Ross move more closely than they have watched a Rick Ross move in a decade. That is the only silver lining hidden inside this entire disaster. Rick Ross finally has the culture's full attention again. What Rick Ross does with that attention will determine everything. 20 years of legacy is on the table, and the next move is not optional. Rick Ross has to swing, and Rick Ross has to swing correctly, because if the next release lands anywhere near 17,200 units, the smiling assassin will not need to post another word. The number itself will do the rest. If you made it this far, you already know this story is not close to over. Hit the like button, drop your prediction in the comments, and tell us who you think is really running hip-hop right now, Rick Ross the Maximalist, Curtis Jackson the Smiling Assassin, or the Invisible King whose name is on none of the tracks and yet somehow all of the headlines. Subscribe so you catch every twist the moment it drops, because the next chapter is already loading, and when it lands, you are going to want to be here for it. Something even bigger is coming next week, and once you see who is involved, this Rick Ross cycle is going to look like the warm-up act.